A friendly Labrador turned fierce after her puppy fell into an abandoned well. No one dared to go near it after that, until one day, when disaster struck, and the villagers came close to making a terrible mistake. The village of Willow Creek, nestled in the gentle embrace of rolling hills and swaying meadows, wore its peacefulness like an old quilt. But recently, an unspoken tension rippled through its quiet streets. It emanated from the old farm at the edge of town, where Jason lived with his once vivacious Labrador, Layla. Layla had always been a beacon of warmth, a streak of caramel fur bounding through sunlit fields, her tail wagging in joyous arcs. Children would race her down the lane, giggling as she let them win, and neighbors would offer scraps of pie crusts and ruffle her ears on their way home. But ever since that day, when Layla's smallest pup had slipped, tumbling helplessly into the abandoned well, something inside her had changed. For a week now, Layla lay motionless by the stone rim, eyes fixed on the dark hollow, as if she were willing her pup back from the shadows. The breeze carried whispers through the grass and rustled the leaves above, but Layla did not stir. Her once lively eyes had dulled, shadowed with a grief that seemed almost human. Jason stood by the window, the wooden frame cool beneath his fingertips. He's an old man, over 75 years old, has experienced many events in life, but when seeing Layla in such a state, heart tight with worry. The old beams of the house groaned softly as if echoing his thoughts. He remembered how she would nudge his hand with her nose, eyes glistening with trust whenever he came home from a long day tending the fields. Now she only growled, a low, wary sound, whenever someone tried to approach. Mrs. Clara, his neighbor, had come by with a fresh loaf one afternoon, her brows knitted in concern. "Jason, have you thought about moving her away from that old well?" she asked. Her voice gentle but insistent, eyes shifting to where Layla lay like a carved statue. Jason shook his head, the weariness in his face deepening the lines that crisscrossed it. "Tried. She nearly snapped at me. She's grieving, Clara. I don't know what else to do." Clara's eyes softened, and she reached out to pat Jason's arm. "Sometimes the only thing you can do is be there. She'll come around when she's ready." But the waiting was hard. Each passing day saw Layla's ribs press more sharply against her fur as she refused to eat, her body slowly surrendering to the weight of loss. Jason, with his heart aching, would sit a few feet away, speaking softly into the cool, open night. "Layla, girl, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The stars flickered overhead, indifferent but beautiful. Layla's ears twitched slightly, a sign she heard him, but still she did not move. A moth fluttered too close, its wings casting ghostly shadows on the rim of the well before disappearing into the dark. Neighbors walked by with hesitant glances, voices dropped to murmurs as they passed. Children giggling nervously as they dared each other to step closer to the old well. But as soon as one brave child inched forward, Layla's eyes snapped to him, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled from her chest. The child froze, the laughter dying on his lips as the others stumbled back, their faces pale with fear. The sight of Layla, once their trusted friend, now transformed into something fierce and unrecognizable, left them stunned and wary, their awe shifting to genuine dread. It was on the 7th night, as the crickets sang their lonesome tune and a soft fog crept over the fields, that Jason sat on the porch, his hands clasped, heart heavy with helplessness. The old boards creaked under his weight, and the distant hoot of an owl punctuated the silence. "Please, girl," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. "Come back to us." Layla's head turned, just slightly, her eyes finding Jason's. There was a flicker there, a spark of recognition or maybe something deeper, a silent communication between a man and his dog that words could never touch. But as quickly as it came, it faded, and Layla's gaze returned to the dark circle of the well, an unwavering sentinel of loss. Jason sighed. It felt like touching a wound. He knew he couldn't force her to leave it behind, just as he couldn't will away the loss she carried. The only thing he could do was be there, silent and steady, hoping that one day the weight of her heart would ease. The town square of Willow Creek rarely buzzed with such energy. On most days it was a place where neighbors exchanged stories over fresh produce and where the hum of life was steady and familiar. But today, concern etched deep lines into their faces as they gathered under the sprawling oak tree, its gnarled branches casting dappled shadows over the crowd. The topic that bound them was the well, the old dry pit that had sat neglected at the edge of the village, now hauntingly connected to grief. Mrs. Taylor, her apron still dusted with flour from her morning's baking, raised her voice first. "It's dangerous, that thing," she said, eyes scanning the circle of familiar faces. "It's a wonder no one thought of filling it in sooner. Kids throw all sorts of junk down there. It's an accident waiting to happen." Mr. Gupta, tall and broad with a steady voice that commanded respect, nodded in agreement. "We've put it off too long. Tomorrow we call the crew, and we end this risk once and for all." The murmurs of approval swept through the crowd, a wave of relief tinged with the weight of past negligence. Jason stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His grey eyes, often calm and observant, were stormy with uncertainty. He knew this decision was logical. The well was an eyesore and a hazard, yet the thought of burying it made something twist inside him. He stole a glance toward his small, weathered house, where Layla was no doubt still lying by the stones, unwavering as ever. She hadn't moved in days, the imprint of her body pressing a hollow into the damp earth. The meeting concluded with firm handshakes and a shared resolution to act. As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Taylor approached Jason. Her voice softened, motherly. "I know it's been hard on her, Jason, but this is for the best. Maybe it'll help her let go." Jason nodded stiffly, the words settling uncomfortably in his chest. "Maybe," he said, though conviction was absent from his tone. His thoughts were back with Layla, the dog who had once filled the farm with life and laughter. Now she was a shadow of herself, a being defined by the hollowness of loss. That evening the sky turned a brooding indigo as Jason approached the well. Layla lay there, motionless but alert, her body a study of contradictions. Her tail no longer wagged. Instead, it curled tightly around her haunches as if protecting a wound that couldn't be seen. Her eyes, once warm and glistening with mischief, now bore a glassy, vacant stare. Yet, behind that stillness, was a current of tension. Her muscles twitched, and her ears pricked sharply at the slightest sound. When a distant creak from the barn disturbed the silence, Layla's hackles rose, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from her throat. "Easy, girl," Jason said softly, his voice shaking. He moved closer, dropping to one knee. The moonlight caught in Layla's eyes, turning them into twin, inky mirrors that seemed to pull him in. "They're coming to close it tomorrow," he whispered, almost to himself. Layla's gaze never wavered from the yawning darkness of the well, but Jason could feel the tension shift in the air, as though she understood every word. Her reaction had grown more intense with each passing day. At first, it was the simple refusal to leave her post, a silent, mournful presence. But as days turned into a week, her silence broke. She'd lash out at shadows, teeth bared, barking until her voice turned hoarse. Even Jason had been met with a fleeting snarl when he'd reached for her food bowl. He knew better than to force her. Layla's grief was raw, jagged, a wound that festered in the quiet of the night. "Why won't you let it go?" Jason's voice cracked, as if he were asking himself just as much as her. The well sat still, indifferent, its old stones soaking in the chill of the evening. Layla shifted, her body tense as a bowstring, eyes boring into the abyss. It was then Jason realized that Layla's vigil was more than grief. It was a warning, silent, but fierce. And for the first time he shivered, not from the cold, but from a growing sense that they were on the edge of something far deeper than loss. Dawn crept over Willow Creek in silken threads of pink and gold, casting long, soft shadows across the quiet village. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the ground, swirling around the roots of the ancient oak and the old well that had become a silent sentinel. But the silence was broken with a jolt. Layla's barking shattered the calm like glass underfoot. Jason woke to the sound, the sharp urgency of it striking his chest like a hammer. He stumbled out of bed, feet tangling in the quilt as he reached for his robe. Outside, Layla's barks came in rapid, raw waves, punctuated by low, mournful whines. The air was thick with tension, so palpable it might have been woven into the mist itself. "Layla!" Jason called as he burst out onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. The dog stood by the well, her body taut, eyes wide and feral. Her claws raked at the earth, sending sprays of dirt scattering. Her bark was no longer the deep, resonant call of a guardian. It was frantic, frayed at the edges with an almost human desperation. By now, the commotion had roused the neighbors. Doors cracked open, faces peered out, sleepy eyes sharpening with concern. Mrs. Taylor clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her brows knitting together. "Jason, what on earth is going on?" she called, voice trembling. Jason didn't have an answer. He moved toward Layla, careful not to make any sudden gestures. "Hey, girl, easy now," he said, his voice low and measured. But Layla was beyond reach. She turned her gaze to him for only a second, eyes glistening with something raw, before lunging toward the well's dark mouth, nails skittering across the stone rim. A gasp rippled through the small crowd that had formed. "She's going to hurt herself," Mr. Gupta shouted, stepping forward, but stopping short when Layla bared her teeth in a snarl that seemed to freeze the morning air. The dog's growl rumbled deep, vibrating through the stones, as if the well itself had joined in her protest. Jason's heart raced, sweat gathering on his brow despite the chill. He reached out, hands trembling. "Layla, please," he whispered, eyes searching hers for a sign, a flicker of recognition. But she was lost in whatever storm surged within her, and when the rumble of a diesel engine approached, her barks reached a fever pitch. The construction team's truck rumbled up the dirt path. Men in bright vests jumping down, steel-toed boots thudding against the ground. One of them, a burly man with a salt-and-pepper beard, raised an eyebrow at the scene. "What's the hold-up?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The noise of their arrival only seemed to agitate Layla further. She lunged again, paws slipping, and Jason's breath caught as she teetered for an agonizing heartbeat before regaining her balance. "We can't start like this," another worker said, shaking his head. "That dog's going to cause an accident." Jason stepped in front of the well, raising a hand to halt the workers. "Just give me a moment," he pleaded. He could feel the eyes of the village on him, the weight of their collective unease pressing down on his shoulders. Layla's barking tapered into a series of choked whines, her body shaking with exhaustion and something more, a fierce, trembling resistance. Jason knelt beside her, voice soft but urgent. "What is it, girl? What are you trying to tell me?" He reached out, fingers brushing against her matted fur, now streaked with dirt. The crowd shifted restlessly. Mrs. Taylor exchanged a worried glance with Mr. Gupta, who simply shook his head. They didn't understand. None of them did. But Jason felt it, a gnawing, creeping certainty that this was more than grief, more than the memory of a lost pup. The construction foreman sighed, casting a glance at his watch. "We're on a schedule here," he called, but Jason didn't look back. His eyes stayed locked on Layla, who met his gaze at last, her eyes softening with a glint of recognition, pleading. All right, we'll wait," the foreman grumbled, waving his team off. The crowd muttered in confusion, some heading back to their homes, others lingering with folded arms and wary eyes. Jason sat beside Layla as the morning sun climbed higher, its light pale and cold. He stroked her back gently, heart pounding with unspoken questions, and Layla lay down, her body coiled with vigilance, as if guarding a secret only she knew. The morning air hung thick with the weight of uncertainty as Jason stood by the kitchen window, eyes fixed on the small rusted latch of the dog pen in the yard. Layla, confined to the wooden pen in the backyard, pressed her body against the bars, eyes wide and dark with despair. The old beams creaked as she pawed at them, her claws scraping a mournful cadence into the air. "Layla, take it easy," Jason murmured from his spot on the porch, but his voice was laced with exhaustion. He ran a calloused hand through his graying hair, eyes straying to the worn path leading to the abandoned well. The team meant to fill it had left abruptly that afternoon, called away by some emergency, and the hollow remained, waiting and silent. The sun began to dip behind the distant hills, bleeding the sky into hues of deep crimson. The shadows grew longer, pooling into corners of the yard like ink. Layla's whines grew louder, more insistent. She pawed at the wire, her claws scratching against the metal in a discordant rhythm that made Jason's jaw clench. The farm was cloaked in silence, save for Layla's relentless sounds of distress. Each whine seemed to carve deeper into Jason's chest, chipping away at the thin veneer of calm he clung to. It was more than grief, he realized. It was something wild, restless, and raw. Layla's cries were no longer the wails of mourning, but of something more, something that gnawed at Jason's gut, sparking a cold dread that made his pulse quicken. "Why tonight, Layla?" he whispered, more to himself than the dog. The question drifted into the night unanswered, but his heart thudded a slow, heavy beat as if some hidden clock had just started ticking. He rubbed his eyes, the fatigue of the past days pressing down on him. But sleep remained out of reach. Instead, a nagging thought took root, unwelcome and persistent. There was something wrong with the well. Jason stood, the creak of the porch board snapping the silence, like a twig underfoot. Layla's eyes flicked up to meet his, desperate, pleading. The intensity in her gaze made him pause. "All right, girl," he said softly, shoulders slumping in resignation. He reached for the latch of the pen, the old iron catching briefly before it released with a click. The moment the door opened, Layla bolted, a streak of pale fur darting toward the well, muscles taut with purpose. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he followed her into the night, a flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. The well loomed ahead, a silent, ancient sentinel surrounded by patches of wild grass. Layla skidded to a halt beside it, turning her head back to Jason, eyes wide and urgent, as if to say, "Look, please, look!" The beam of the flashlight wavered in Jason's shaking hand before he steadied himself, heart hammering in his chest. "What is it, Layla?" The words barely escaped his lips as he leaned over the stone rim, breath frosting in the crisp air. He aimed the beam down, the light cutting through the darkness like a blade. At first, there was only the slick glisten of mud, matted leaves, and scattered refuse. But then, in the shifting shadows, something caught the light. A pale, small shape, half submerged beneath the murky water and tangled debris. Jason's blood turned to ice. "Oh, God!" he gasped, the flashlight slipping from his fingers and clattering against the stone. It rolled once, then stopped, casting a dim light across the figure below. It was a child, no older than 3 or 4, curled tightly, a fragile shell among the muck. The child's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, nearly imperceptible. "Layla," Jason whispered hoarsely, voice breaking as he stumbled backward. The dog whined, her body pressed against the cold stones, eyes never leaving the well. She had known, somehow, the whole time. The stillness of the evening shattered as Jason's voice rang out, sharp and urgent. "Help! We need help over here!" The echo carried across the open fields, reaching the quiet corners of the village. Within moments, doors creaked open, lanterns flickered to life, and feet thudded against the cobblestones as neighbors rushed to Jason's side. Layla stood resolute, her bark slicing through the cool air like a clarion call, each note laced with urgency and a mother's fury. "Dear God, what's happened?" Mrs. Taylor gasped as she pushed her way forward, her eyes wide with fear. Mr. Gupta arrived, breathless, with a heavy coil of rope slung over one shoulder, eyes narrowing with immediate purpose as he assessed the scene. Jason pointed into the black maw of the well, where a faint, uneven sound, a child's ragged breath, rose up to meet them. The crowd stilled, the gravity of the moment sinking in like a weight. Layla paced at the edge, her paws scraping the dirt, never letting her gaze waver. The air thickened with the mingled scents of damp earth and sweat. "We need to get him out, now." Jason's voice broke, but his resolve did not. A group of men formed an impromptu rescue team, with Mr. Gupta tying the rope securely around his waist. "Hold steady!" he commanded, his baritone cutting through the mounting chaos. The rope strained as he descended, disappearing into the shadowy well. The minutes stretched unbearably thin, each breath a struggle against the mounting tension. Layla's barks grew frantic, her claws digging into the ground as if to anchor herself from leaping in after them. Jason reached out, placing a firm but trembling hand on her back. "Easy, girl. We're bringing him back." A murmur swept through the onlookers as Mr. Gupta re-emerged, his arms wrapped around the limp form of a small boy. Dirt streaked across the child's face, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, uncertain movements. The crowd exhaled as one, a collective sigh mingling relief and shock. "He's alive," Mr. Gupta rasped, hoisting the boy carefully over the lip of the well. Cheers erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling with emotion. Mrs. Taylor wiped at her eyes, and someone whispered a prayer under their breath. Jason didn't waste a moment. "Get my truck!" he shouted, scooping the boy into his arms. His heart hammered as he felt the fragile weight, the boy's damp hair brushing against his cheek. Layla, sensing the critical nature of the moment, bounded after them, her eyes fixed on the boy. Her whines softer now but insistent. The truck roared to life, its tires spitting gravel as they sped down the narrow path that led to the nearest hospital. Inside the cab, the air was thick with Jason's labored breathing and Layla's quiet, anxious whimpers. The dog leaned over, her warm tongue lapping at the boy's pale face, nudging him gently as if willing him to stir. "Come on, son. Just hold on, Jason whispered, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. A small, feeble noise escaped the boy's lips, a sound that sent a shiver of hope through Jason. Layla's ears perked, and she gave a small, tentative bark. The old truck rattled and groaned as it flew over potholes and bends, but Jason didn't dare slow down. Back in the village, the tension was palpable. Mrs. Clara stood with her phone pressed to her ear, explaining the situation to the police with quick, clipped words. Lanterns still burned outside, casting golden pools of light onto worried faces. "They'll make it," Mrs. Taylor said, more to herself than anyone else. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken fears and fervent wishes. At the hospital entrance, the headlights of Jason's truck cut through the night like a beacon. Nurses and orderlies rushed out, pulling the boy from Jason's arms and laying him gently on a stretcher. Layla watched intently, standing on her hind legs to peer into the boy's face, her tail still for once. The boy's chest rose with a steady, if shallow, rhythm, and a nurse called out orders as they wheeled him inside. Jason slumped against the truck, the adrenaline leaving him spent and shaking. Layla, ever vigilant, sat beside him, pressing her warm body against his leg as if to say, "We're not done, but we're here." The night air settled around them, filled with the quiet hum of voices inside, the promise of life holding on, and the deep, unbreakable bond that had just saved it. The sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the hospital hummed with activity, a stark contrast to the hushed anxiety that clung to Jason. He sat, hunched over in a plastic chair, fingers laced tightly together as if binding his worry would keep it contained. Layla, tethered by a leash to his wrist, sat obediently at his feet. Her eyes, once haunted with grief, now flickered with restless energy as they followed the rush of nurses and doctors passing by. A nurse with a kind face approached, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Jason?" she asked, her voice a blend of exhaustion and professionalism. Jason nodded, the tension in his jaw softening just slightly. The boy's stable. Mild head trauma and a broken leg, but nothing life-threatening. He was incredibly lucky. Jason let out a shaky breath, the relief spreading through his body like warm embers on a cold night. Layla, as if sensing the change, stood and leaned into his side, her tail giving a tentative wag. "Thank you," Jason said, voice hoarse from the weight of the past hours. The nurse nodded, a small smile crossing her lips before she moved on to the next task, leaving Jason and Layla in the soft hum of machines and muted conversations. Before long, the clatter of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Jason turned to see a man and woman rush in, their faces etched with worry and hope. The woman, her hair wild and eyes red from crying, scanned the room until they landed on Jason and Layla. Recognition flickered, then erupted. "Jason?" The man, Mr. Thompson, spoke with a voice tight with emotion. Jason rose, astonishment mingling with a rush of memories. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he murmured, the realization washing over him like a cold wave. The couple who had frequented his farm months ago, when they filled tin pails with fresh milk, while their little boy giggled and played with Layla. "Oh, God, he's alive!" Mrs. Thompson choked out, eyes pleading for reassurance. Jason nodded, a soft smile breaking through the lines of fatigue on his face. "He's going to be okay. The doctors said he'll recover." At this, Mrs. Thompson let out a sound between a sob and a laugh, and she rushed past him into the room where her son lay, pale but breathing. Mr. Thompson followed. Layla's eyes tracked their every move, a new alertness lighting up her expression. She gave a soft whine, as if urging them to let her in, to see the child she'd protected with such fierce loyalty. Jason patted her head. "It's okay, girl. You did good." The minutes that followed passed in a slow, surreal blur. From the open door, muffled voices reached him, the sound of tears turning to laughter, the rustle of relief filling the room like sunlight chasing shadows. Then the Thompsons emerged, eyes wet and grateful. "Jason, thank you. I don't know how to even begin." Mr. Thompson's voice cracked raw with emotion. "And Layla, if it weren't for her, she's been restless ever since he fell in." Jason interrupted gently, his own voice thick with the memory. Layla, as if on cue, stood and padded to the threshold, her gaze locked on the sleeping boy. Mrs. Thompson knelt, reaching for the dog with hands that trembled. "Thank you, Layla," she whispered, stroking the dog's head. Layla's eyes softened, the shadows of her recent grief replaced with a glimmer of contentment. She turned and looked at Jason, tail wagging more steadily now, as if to say her duty was fulfilled. Inside, the boy stirred, eyelids fluttering open to the sight of Layla's familiar face. A small, tired smile broke across his lips. "Layla?" he whispered, voice drowsy and soft. The dog moved closer, pressing her nose into his palm. And in that moment, as the hospital room swelled with warmth, Jason knew that the bond forged between them all had shifted, deepened. It was a bond born from fear and loss, now tempered by hope and unwavering loyalty. The days following the rescue were a blend of relief and wonder, as if the entire town of Willow Creek had awoken from a long, somber dream. Layla, whose eyes had once mirrored the grief of loss, now brightened with a spark that had been absent for too long. It was a slow transformation, one that Jason observed with a quiet, swelling hope. She trotted around the farm, tail wagging with renewed energy. But it was when the little boy, her young friend, arrived that Layla's joy truly bloomed. The boy, now with a cast on his leg and a wide, grateful smile, would squeal as Layla bounded up to him, careful not to jostle his injured limb. They spent long afternoons together in the warm sun, the boy's laughter ringing out as Layla nudged a ball gently towards him with her nose. Jason would stand by the porch, arms folded, a small smile creasing the lines of his weathered face. The sight of Layla's tail thumping happily against the grass was a balm to his soul. "They're saying she's a hero," Mrs. Taylor had said one morning, pressing a basket of muffins into Jason's hands. The scent of cinnamon filled the air as she continued, eyes bright with pride. "There's talk of a gathering to honor her." Jason felt his chest tighten, not with worry this time, but with something deeper, gratitude. "It's more than she deserves," he murmured, though a warmth crept up his neck at the thought. Layla had always been more than just a dog. She was a companion, a guardian, and now a savior. The town moved quickly, and within days the community center was adorned with ribbons and banners, declaring, "Layla, our four-legged hero." When Jason arrived with Layla by his side, the crowd erupted into applause. Layla, usually shy in such situations, sat gracefully, ears perking up as she surveyed the gathering with curiosity. "Look at her," Mr. Gupta said, nudging Jason with a grin. "She knows she's special." Jason chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind Layla's ears. "Yeah, she does." The mayor, a robust man with a booming voice, stepped up to the makeshift stage. "Today we gather not just to celebrate an act of bravery, but to remind ourselves of the bond we share with those who walk on four legs," he said, eyes sweeping over the crowd. "Layla's loyalty and instincts saved a life and reminded us of the value of watchfulness and love." The applause swelled again as Layla shifted, tail sweeping the floor in rhythmic thumps. Jason felt a lump in his throat, pride mingling with the bittersweet memories of the past weeks. Layla turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Jason's as if seeking reassurance. "You're a good girl, Layla," he whispered, the emotion thick in his voice. A group of local reporters angled for better shots, cameras clicking as the Thompsons, with the boy leaning on crutches, approached. Mrs. Thompson's eyes shimmered with tears, but her smile was radiant. "We owe you everything," she said, her voice trembling as she knelt to stroke Layla's fur. The boy reached out, wincing slightly but laughing when Layla licked his fingers. "Layla, can we play later?" he asked, eyes wide with hope. The dog's response was a soft bark, her tail swishing with enthusiasm. Reporters jotted down notes as the story of friendship, loyalty, and courage unfolded under the afternoon sun. The scene, touched with a light breeze and the scent of fresh grass, was a testament to resilience. Jason stood a step back, observing the chatter and laughter, the flashes of cameras, and Layla's calm, steady presence amidst it all. Later that evening, the Thompsons stayed a while longer, sharing stories on Jason's porch. Layla lay at the boy's feet, her eyes fluttering closed, ears occasionally flicking at the sound of crickets. Mr. Thompson turned to Jason, a soft smile playing on his lips. "We'll be back soon. We wouldn't want Layla to miss her best friend." Jason nodded, a rare, unguarded smile breaking across his face. "She'd like that. We both would." And as the stars blinked to life in the sky, the farm, once steeped in silence and shadow, now echoed with the quiet murmur of joy, companionship, and a hero's well-deserved peace. At Jason's farm, the sun's light caught the morning dew, scattering it across the fields like diamonds. But what truly brought warmth was the sound of laughter, a boy's laughter, bright and carefree, mingled with the deep, joyful barks of Layla. Layla, no longer the solemn sentinel by the well, bounded across the yard, her tail swishing in wide, exuberant arcs. The boy, a grin that stretched ear to ear, leaned on a crutch while trying to keep up. His parents, the Thompsons, stood nearby, eyes glistening as they watched their son play. The trauma of those lost days had left its mark, but it was fading, replaced by the kind of happiness that takes root only after loss. Jason sat on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. His gaze swept over the scene, heart both full and heavy. Age had etched lines into his face, lines that deepened with each year. Now, as he watched Layla frolic with the boy she had saved, he felt a pull, a quiet voice in his mind urging him to think ahead. He called Mr. Thompson over, beckoning with a small nod. "Jason?" Mr. Thompson asked, stepping up with a look of mild concern. Jason set down his mug, the steam curling into the crisp air. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low and deliberate. "If anything ever happens to me, I'd like you and your family to take care of Layla. She's part of me, but more than that, she's meant something to your boy, too." A look of surprise flitted across Mr. Thompson's face, quickly replaced by understanding. "We'd be honored, Jason. Layla's a hero, and she's always welcome with us." Hearing the affirmation brought Jason a bittersweet sense of peace. He turned his eyes back to the yard, where Layla had trotted up to the boy, pressing her nose gently to his outstretched hand. Her eyes, once clouded with grief, now gleamed with something new, a lightness, a joy rekindled. Mrs. Thompson soon joined them, a smile breaking through her composed features. "Tommy's been happier than I've seen in months," she said, voice catching. "Layla's done more than just save his life. She's given him back his laughter." Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Layla and the Thompson family grew. Videos and snapshots of Tommy and Layla, her nuzzling his cheek or chasing after him with a wagging tail, found their way onto social media. The posts spread, touching hearts far beyond the village. Comments flooded in. "What a brave dog." Stories like this remind me there's good in the world. The tale of Layla and Tommy became a beacon, sparking conversations about loyalty, love, and resilience. Visitors began to trickle into the village, drawn by the tale that had captured the internet. They came to see Layla, to stand on the porch of Jason's modest farmhouse and meet the man whose quiet strength had nurtured such a remarkable animal. With each visit, Jason's farm transformed. It became a gathering place not just for those curious to meet Layla, but for those who wanted to share stories of their own pets, of loss, and of finding hope again. "Layla's famous now, you know," Mr. Thompson said one afternoon, giving Jason a playful nudge as another car pulled up the dirt driveway. Jason chuckled, a sound that felt lighter than it had in years. "Guess she's got more visitors than I ever did," he replied, a glint of pride in his eye. But beyond the visits and stories, something deeper took root in the village. The people of Willow Creek began to talk about how they could take better care of their surroundings, how they could ensure the safety of both their children and their beloved pets. Layla's story had become a gentle reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of looking after one another, whether human or animal. And as the evening sun dipped behind the hills, casting the farm in a warm, golden glow, Layla settled at Jason's feet, head resting contentedly as Tommy played nearby. The air, once filled with tension and sorrow, now thrummed with quiet, steady peace. And that, my friends, is the incredible story of Layla, a hero who reminded us all of the power of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Watching how one dog's unwavering loyalty could transform not just one life, but an entire community, is a powerful reminder of how even the smallest acts of courage can ripple outward and touch countless hearts. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with the animals in your life. Share your stories in the comments below. I can't wait to read them. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories that inspire and uplift. Until next time, take care, cherish the bonds around you, and remember, sometimes the greatest heroes have 4 paws and a wagging tail.